When I was a kid, I remember always using my school's library to check out and peruse books involving mythologies from all sorts of cultures and realms. It was something that really fascinated me as a child, and to this day those tales, particularly those in Greek and Norse pantheons, have always stuck with me. And it's no surprise that such extravagant tales that involve gods, mortals, and supernatural abilities have found their way into modern video gaming culture. But there does seem to be one mythos that stretches leagues beyond any other and is referenced countless times in games of multiple genres. Greek, Egyptian, and other mythologies have made their way into games as well. Assassin's Creed, for example, because of its historical attention to detail, derives inspiration from just about as many cultures as it can get its hands on. But these subtle and oftentimes insignificant nods to various mythologies are very little compared to the proliferating status of the Norse pantheon, whether it's entirely a main source of inspiration for side-scrollers like Volgarr the Viking, or something as little as Nordic-themed cosmetic items in popular FPS games like Overwatch. So in light of its popularity, let's try and break this all down. Where did this sudden craving and thirst for Scandinavian mythos come from, and why is it so effective? I enjoyed Hellblade just as much as any other person that picked it up, I think. The reviews that came in were extremely favorable, and for a game so purposefully inconsistent in its action and in its plot telling, it ended up receiving some of the most consistent feedback of most games that were even released that year. There were few negative criticisms having to do with the game, other than the subject matter or the story just wasn't really their style. Hellblade puts you in the riddled and damaged mind of a heroine named Senua, a person hell-bent on a quest to find her lover while also quite literally battling the demons inside her own head. It's both a stylistic retelling of popular Nordic lore and a clever commentary on debilitating mental illnesses like psychosis. This journey into the nightmarish realm of Helheim quickly turns into an unsalvageable downward spiral towards madness and mental decay. Hellblade doesn't make a big deal of mentioning it, but there are characters and tales that represent some of the other 9 realms. Surt, the god of fire, or really a fire giant if we're staying as true as possible to the mythology, is one of the inhabitants of the realm of Muspelheim, and Surt plays quite an integral role in the final battle of Ragnarok as he sails southward on a giant ship and slays the Aesir god Freyr. According to the Norse mythos, the gods of both Aesir and Vanir, the 2 Norse pantheons, and the giants were of arguably equal strength, somewhat akin to the Titans in Greek mythos. And though we don't see these other realms physically, there are other references to Vanaheim, Muspelheim, Jotunheim, the land of giants, and other worlds referenced by lore stones and dialogue that take place through the game. The most recent and most popular retelling of Nordic mythos right now is obviously Santa Monica's newest addition to its now 8-game-long God of War franchise, revamping the integrity of Kratos' adventures that previously derived its lore from the Greek side of mythology. The studio has decided to cross the bridge over to Icelandic territory, exploring the supernatural folklore of Northern Europe. And it's interesting to see what these games have in common outside of its preferred pantheon. God of War's history, as it's been evolved down the Santa Monica timeline, has always been about rage, vengeance, and being able to take supernatural beings as powerful as gods and ripping their heads off with your bare hands. It was profane, ridiculous, and it just didn't give a shit. And one thing that's immediately noticeable as the folklore transitions into Norse territory is that most of that craziness is gone. The new God of War is less about going down the line of gods and viciously feeding them all to the meat grinder that is Kratos, and more about surviving and outlasting your adversity, much like what Hellblade was. It's easy enough to compare the games of an 8-game-long franchise like God of War, but independent standalone games like Hellblade are a little harder to do so. Since we don't have an entire lineup of Hellblade games to compare and contrast, The only remaining means of doing so are Ninja Theory's earlier projects like BMC and Heavenly Sword. But even then, the allure of both of these games were anchored in how creative you could get with chaining combos together after you were thrown into a pit of quite literally hundreds of enemies, and were just told to go crazy. Ninja Theory's entire track record is based around this carefree hack-and-slash one-man army sort of mechanic, and with Hellblade, they knew this sort of approach wouldn't align well with the dark and brooding story they wanted to tell, and it certainly would not align well with the mythos as gritty and as unpleasant as Nordic lore. The North Germanic population lived in a threateningly frigid climate, very unlike the pantheon of Greece, whose country of origin is in a much more temperate environment. Living in places like Scandinavia and Northern Europe proved to be especially difficult. Resources were sparse, famine and disease were inevitable, and what little food any village could grow would likely be pillaged and taken by Norsemen warriors called Vikings, who began and ended most of their problems the same way, with violence. In the North Germanic lands, overcoming your adversity was next to impossible. To give you a good idea of how savage and uncivilized Norse culture was during the 8th century, the Blood Eagle ritual was a graphically violent form of sacrifice to the gods, carried out by these Norsemen, and I'm sure as shit not going to show an image of it because of demonetization, but look it up and let me know what you find. It's some real Texas Chainsaw Massacre type shit. And this same motif of standing up to and somehow conquering innumerable hardships and defying the odds of survival can be seen more and more in how video games are written and developed. Games like Uncharted, The Last of Us, Dark Souls, and more recently Hellblade and God of War all share this common motif of living, breaking through impossible adversity to ensure your survival at any means necessary. It's the grittiness of putting your character through a type of physical and emotional hell that deals with not only adapting to a harsh climate, but also with themes that are very human, like loss, or having to leave someone else behind to ensure your own survival. In Northern Europe, these were conditions that people farmed, battled, and lived in. The idea of outlasting such incredible adversity and facing such unpleasant living conditions are part of what makes games like God of War, Hellblade, and the others I mentioned so enjoyable. When you fell a giant beast with nothing but a small battle axe, you really do feel like a god of sorts. Dark Souls encouraged your perseverance despite throwing yourself at the demons of Lordran, only to fall again and again. And taking that a step or two further with Hellblade, this strenuous physical battle was coupled with battling your own personal demons inside one's own head, all while taking on impossible quests and revisiting your childhood as Senua, reliving the harsh abuse and traumatizing younger years of her life. The marriage of Nordic myth and the grueling survival in video games is far from a coincidence, I think. A lot of stories in Norse mythology involve an extremely painful loss, usually in the family. And in survival-oriented games like Hellblade or The Last of Us, you realize these characters in these games have all experienced that same sort of loss, usually either during the very beginning of the game's plot or before the events of the game even happen. The tumultuous violence and impossible adversity that encapsulated 8th century Northern Europe clicks really well with these types of stories. A story of a father coping with the loss of his wife, or of his daughter, or of a young female warrior slowly and helplessly surrendering to her mental illness. The pain of grief and death was the norm in 8th century Northern Europe because during this time, it was extremely easy to die, either to famine or to an axe being buried into your skull. The roadblocks that people so commonly fought against in North Germanic countries is only represented and, in some instances, replicated by some of the most well-received video games in the past few years. The theme of not only surviving, but doing so in such a miraculous and unbelievable way that it's sort of fun to see how much shit your character gets put through the game, and more importantly, how and if they overcome it later on. The synergy of Norse mythology and video games has been plentiful, and to me that's no surprise at all considering the abrasiveness of Northern Germanic culture around 1200 years ago. But really, all I'm hoping this means is Santa Monica has realized this and gives us a shit ton more God of War games like the one they just developed. Hey, it might happen. Thanks for tuning into The Forge. Please consider subscribing if you aren't already, and ring the bell if you'd like to stay up to date with every video I release in the future. Thanks again, guys. I love the hell out of all of you. See you next time.